It's my pleasure to be here on our inaugural lecture that's going on YouTube Live, and I hope it all works out and technically, and I hope everyone enjoys my lecture, which is, I'm going to share my screen now. I will get right into that. So my lecture is entitled The Crane-Balestier Letters, Holland Lodge in the Age of Schisms. And it is all about Holland Lodge No. 8, which, as you can tell by the number of the lodge, number 8, it is a very old lodge. It's one of the oldest lodges still in existence in the state of New York. It was founded in 1787 by a number of Dutch settlers who were seeking permission to work in the Dutch language. And in addition to being a very old lodge, it is a very distinguished lodge in terms of its membership. Many of its members have been some of the most eminent and the most significant Masons and indeed men in the state or in the country. For example, John Jacob Astor, who was the wealthiest man of his time, was a member of Holland Lodge. Also a member was Baron von Steuben, who was a Prussian general who assisted in the American Revolutionary War effort and was a hero of the American Revolution. Holland Lodge also has produced many Grand Masters, including DeWitt Clinton, who, in addition to being a Grand Master of Masons in New York, was also a senator from New York, a governor of New York, and a presidential candidate. And more recently, a successful presidential candidate, Franklin Roosevelt, was a member of Holland Lodge, and he held a Holland Lodge dues card during his presidency. And I have here his dues card for 1942. So any way you look at Holland Lodge, it's certainly one of the most remarkable lodges in the craft. And books have been written about the history of Holland Lodge. Papers have been written about it. It's a very thoroughly studied subject. However, there is a story about Holland Lodge that has never been told. And these books and papers skip over this story. They don't have anything to say about it, which is that for a period of 3 years, which was from 1855 to 1858, Holland Lodge was clandestine. So it was not in amity with the regular Grand Lodge for a period of 3 years. And my story tonight is the story of how that happened. The way I got started on this project was I was doing some research, and I borrowed a book from Cornell University Library. And this book turned out to be a collection of papers and pamphlets that were all just bound together, kind of a miscellany of materials. And in this book was bound together with everything else were 2 letters, and not copies of letters, but rather the original letters on embossed stationery. And I was flipping through this book and read these letters, and what I read in these letters, frankly, amazed me. My jaw kind of hit the floor, and I thought that I had made a significant discovery about the history of our craft in New York. Now, these 2 letters were written by John J. Crane, who was the portrait here on the left of my slide here. John Crane was the master of Holland Lodge during its period of being clandestine. And he's writing these letters several years after the fact to Joseph Balestier here on the right, who was the master of Holland Lodge at that time, as after the clandestine period was over. And in these letters, Crane really spills the beans about what was going on in Holland Lodge and the whole story. And these letters contain facts which are not in any public document. So really, it really did constitute an important discovery. Now, I'm going to tell the story of Holland Lodge's Odyssey, and I'm going to save the letters for the end, okay? So it's going to be a big reveal. If you stick with me through the whole presentation, you get the reward of hearing what really happened. And I hope it's a story that's fascinated for me for years, and I hope that you find it interesting as well. Now, this story about Holland Lodge is just one episode in a much larger story, which is called the Age of Schisms in New York. And the Age of Schisms was a period of about 40 years prior to the Civil War, when Freemasonry in New York was in a state of constant turmoil. And there was a lot of dissension and arguments among brothers and among lodges, which sometimes broke out into schisms, and in one incident actually caused a riot at the annual communication of the Grand Lodge. And I have here on this slide a timeline that I've prepared of this Age of Schisms, just to give you an idea of the back and forth that was going on. And this was not a great time to be a New York Mason, but it is a very interesting time period for the historian to study, because it is full of drama and interesting characters and interesting storylines, of which my story tonight is just one. And my timeline here is meant to represent the various grand bodies in New York who claim jurisdiction over Masonry in New York. And the purple bar that runs through the middle of it is intended to represent the regular Grand Lodge, as the lineage of the regular Grand Lodge that goes all the way back to the Provincial Grand Lodge of New York and continues to the present day. And if you look at that purple bar and look all the way on the right-hand side of it, I have a marker here in 1860, which is when South Carolina seceded from the Union and the Civil War started to appear on the horizon. Okay, so this is to put this period in context. We're talking about the pre-Civil War era, and this Age of Schisms really ended in New York just prior to the Civil War breaking out. My story about Holland Lodge begins in 1855, so I have this green marker here in 1855. But I would like to explain a little bit about the broader context of the Age of Schisms, because it is important to understanding the story. Now, we Masons, we place a very high value on peace and harmony and brothers working together and getting along. So you may ask, what was going on during this period that caused these splits and all this fighting and dissension? Well, the major force that was really tearing the Grand Lodge apart was rivalry between the lodges that met in the city of New York and near the city of New York, and the lodges that met in the remainder of the state, the country lodges. And the reason for this rivalry was that, as we know, the Grand Lodge meets in the city of New York, which is a major population center, obviously, and has lots of brothers and lots of lodges in it. And these city lodges were in a position, kind of geographically, to dominate the Grand Lodge in its deliberations, because it was very easy for their brothers to attend Grand Lodge and vote. Whereas, if you were in Buffalo or something, it's much more difficult to attend or to vote or have any influence in the Grand Lodge. So the city lodges tended to dominate the affairs of the Grand Lodge, and the country lodges were complaining that the city lodges were abusing their position to the detriment of the country lodges by doing things like taking all the good jobs and making other decisions which they felt did not give them proper respect. And this dissension started occurring very early in our history, and it continued on for a period of many decades. And there were numerous issues where the dividing line was really the city on one side and the country on the other side. And the city lodges, for their part, they had complaints about the country lodges. For one thing, the country lodges actually outnumbered the city lodges. So the city lodges were concerned that if the country got their act together and got organized, that they could do something like move the Grand Lodge out of the city, maybe to Albany or something like that. And there was some talk about that. So the city was really fearful of what the country lodges could do to them potentially. And on top of this, if that's not enough, okay, on top of this, the city lodges and the city brothers, they were arguing amongst themselves pretty frequently about this or that. And on top of that, you had personal clashes and personal ambition that would cause brothers to escalate disputes, because a lot of the brothers who were involved in these conflicts, they had, what you might call an old-fashioned sense of honor, that you didn't want to admit that you'd made a mistake. You never wanted to back down from a fight. So once a dispute did break out, it tended to escalate, and it took a long time to resolve. So this all made a very combustible mixture, which from time to time would break out into an actual schism, where a group of lodges would split off from the regular Grand Lodge and declare that they were a Grand Lodge. They were going to make their own Grand Lodge. And this happened several times, as you can see on my timeline. So the first time this occurred was in 1823, when a group of city lodges did split off and formed a city Grand Lodge of city lodges, right? The remainder of the Grand Lodge is, historians call it the Country Grand Lodge. And this persisted for a number of years, 4 years, until 1827, when they got back together, and they all agreed that really there should only be one Grand Lodge, one Grand Master in the state of New York. But the troubles were far from over, because as you can see here in 1826, I have a marker that the Morgan incident occurred, which was the disappearance of William Morgan and his presumed murder by Freemasons to keep him from disclosing the secrets of Freemasonry, which touched off the anti-Masonic period. And there was a period of maybe 10 years or so when Freemasons were actually actively persecuted throughout the country, which it was a devastating situation, and many lodges just went dark. Although the lodges in the country really took it worse than the lodges in urbanized areas like the city, who survived a little better. But that was a very, very serious situation that almost wiped out the craft. Now, after some period of time, the public started to kind of get bored with this persecution and this anti-Masonic fervor, and the craft began to recover and began to grow again and attract new members and grow new lodges. But it wasn't long before there was another schism that broke out. And this schism was in 1837, when some city Masons who had been expelled by the Grand Lodge decided that they weren't going to take it, and they were going to form their own Grand Lodge, which is St. John's Grand Lodge. They reunited with the Grand Lodge in 1850, but in a few years they tried to revive their schismatic group in 1853. And now those organizations really don't have anything to do with my story, so I won't say anything more about them. But there was yet another major schism, which was the Phillips Grand Lodge schism in 1849, which has a lot to do with my story. So I will be saying more about them. Now that group broke off, as I said, in 1849, and lasted for 9 years until 1858, when they too reunited with the Grand Lodge. But in the period around 1855, the situation was getting a bit ridiculous, in that there were actually, at that time, there were 6 different bodies which claimed jurisdiction over symbolic Freemasonry, meaning the first 3 degrees of Masonry, in the state of New York. You had the regular Grand Lodge, and then you had the Phillips Grand Lodge. Also, the Grand Lodge of Hamburg, Germany, had two lodges in the city, one of them being Pythagoras Lodge, and then they were trying to get more lodges in the city, and this caused an international incident, which is a very interesting story, but I'm not going to go off on that tangent. But you had the Grand Lodge of Hamburg, Germany operating in the city of New York. Also, there were African lodges under a Grand Lodge of North America, so Prince Hall or similar Freemasonry. There was the revived St. John's Grand Lodge, and there was also a clandestine Scottish Rite organization, a Cernowist Scottish Rite organization that had blue lodges working in the Scottish Rite, the first 3 degrees of Scottish Rite Masonry in New York. So this is a situation where things were really spiraling out of control here. But to kind of home in on what's important to my story tonight, there was the Phillips Grand Lodge. So let me introduce the Phillips Grand Lodge. What was that all about? The Phillips Grand Lodge, just to put this in a larger context, now, let me back up a second. Everyone who's been to Grand Lodge and has been to a Grand Lodge session knows that it operates kind of like a parliament or a legislature of the craft in New York, where the members are there to cast votes on matters that are before the Grand Lodge. For example, electing the Grand Line, voting on propositions and resolutions, amendments to the Constitution, and so on. And every lodge in good standing is entitled to send a representative to Grand Lodge to vote as the representative. And also, there are a number of individuals who can vote in Grand Lodge, not being a representative of anyone, but rather they have a vote in their own right, like the Grand Master, the Deputy Grand Master, past Grand Masters, and others. They get to vote in Grand Lodge. Now, it used to be the case that any past master of a lodge had the right to attend Grand Lodge and vote. So not as a representative, but they had an individual right to attend Grand Lodge and vote. Now, if you think about that for a second, that sets up a kind of a vicious situation, because as the years go on, there's more and more past masters. And the group of past masters who can show up and vote grows year after year. And this especially tended to amplify the power of the city lodges, right? Because it was the city past masters who would actually attend Grand Lodge and vote. So the situation grew year after year until things were really getting out of hand. At one point, St. John's Lodge No. 1 had 19 members voting in Grand Lodge, and really they just should have had one, mostly because their past masters would show up and vote. So this was really, this was an untenable situation, and there was a movement in the late 1840s to amend our Constitution to take away the right of past masters to vote. So they would be allowed to attend sessions, but they wouldn't have a vote. And this constitutional amendment did go through, but, there were some city past masters who saw their power being taken away, and they decided that they were not going to take this line down. So this group of city past masters got organized and decided that they were going to fight this constitutional amendment by any means they could. So in 1849, when at the annual communication, when it was going to be announced, yes, we have amended the Constitution, and past masters can no longer vote. Well, these city past masters showed up at this annual communication in numbers and in force, and they actually caused a riot at the annual communication, and caused great disorder, and they then walked out of the meeting, and the next day they convened as the Grand Lodge of New York. They said that we are now the Grand Lodge of New York, and that other body, the one that we just walked out of, is clandestine. And we call them the Phillips Grand Lodge because their first Grand Master was Isaac Phillips, who I have a photograph of here. But they did not call themselves the Phillips Grand Lodge. They said, we are the Grand Lodge. Now, it was a little silly because this Phillips group, they were always a very small group. They had maybe 20 lodges, and the other group, okay, had maybe 350 lodges. So they were dwarfed by the regular Grand Lodge. However, they claimed to be the regular Grand Lodge and that all the lodges of New York were under their jurisdiction. And the lodges who were not going with them were just in arrears because they weren't, filing returns and paying dues to them. So I don't know, how much they really believed this themselves, but that was definitely the position that they took. And some of the leading lodges in the city went with Phillips. St. John's #1, Independent Royal Arch #2. Many of the leading city lodges went with Phillips, at least initially. There was also litigation filed in courts of New York. I think there were at least 3 lawsuits filed by various parties seeking to resolve matters of property, like who really owned the funds of the Grand Lodge. The Phillips body said it was their money. The regular Grand Lodge said, no, it's our money. And so the matter was in litigation. So I'm a lawyer, and I know very well that litigation is always uncertain. You don't know how a litigation is going to turn out. And that added a lot of uncertainty to this situation because, maybe you could laugh at this little group of 20 lodges claiming to be the Grand Lodge of New York, but you don't know how that lawsuit's going to turn out. And this had an effect throughout the country because other jurisdictions were really uncertain about who the regular Grand Lodge was. And New York Masons were sometimes refused admittance to meetings outside the state because they couldn't tell who was regular and who wasn't regular. So this was all just a massive mess. And on top of this, it gets worse. On top of this, there were some Masons in the regular Grand Lodge who thought that really the Grand Lodge actually should be divided. And you might say, well, it looks like it's divided numerous different ways. But no, this group within the regular Grand Lodge said, look, there's so much dissension between the city and the country that, in their view, the peace between the city and country was impossible. It was literally impossible. And this had gone on for decades. So their point of view was, look, the arguing is never going to end unless we actually divide the Grand Lodge, but do it in a proper way, not with a riot, but do it in a proper way where everyone agrees that there's going to be two Grand Lodges in New York, because if we do that, that'll be the end of the fighting. And that's the only thing that's going to end this fighting. So there were various proposals being circulated around the state to maybe go back to a city Grand Lodge and a country Grand Lodge, which had been tried and abandoned, earlier, or maybe a northern and a western, northern and a southern, or eastern and a western. Just draw a line, draw some kind of a line, and say, this is the geographical dividing line. And this slide here is a proposal that was laid before the Grand Lodge at the annual communication in June 1854, saying, why don't we do this? We'll just draw the line so that everyone south and west of Delaware, Greene, and Columbia counties would be part of like a Southern Grand Lodge, and the rest of the state, would have their own Grand Lodge. Okay. Now this point of view was definitely a minority view in the regular Grand Lodge. The majority really did not want to entertain these proposals to divide the Grand Lodge. They really thought that we should stick together. So one of the leaders of the Unity majority, the Unity faction in the regular Grand Lodge, which was Joseph Evans. And I mention him specifically because he's an important character in my story about Holland Lodge, which I will get to. I'll get to that eventually. But Evans was a proponent of unity, and he fought many battles against the schismatics who were trying to split the Grand Lodge. Now he was deputy Grand Master or Grand Master during many of these years, and he used his authority and his gavel to shut down these efforts to divide the Grand Lodge. So if anyone tried to, introduce a resolution or form a committee or a report, something involving splitting the Grand Lodge, he would gavel it down. He'd say it's out of order. We're not even going to discuss it. So this minority of brothers who sincerely thought the Grand Lodge should divide, they were complaining that they could not get a fair hearing for their ideas. So this was the massive mess in 1854, 1855 that I'm going to now take up my story here with Holland Lodge. So Holland Lodge, what was their position in all this? What was Holland Lodge up to during this period? Well, Holland Lodge started out remaining loyal to the regular Grand Lodge, so they did not go off with the Phillips group. They stayed in the regular Grand Lodge until June 11, 1855. On that day, Holland Lodge declared independence. So they declared they had no Grand Lodge, and they continued to meet as an independent lodge for a period of time until January 23rd, 1857, when they joined the Phillips Grand Lodge. They didn't go back to the regular Grand Lodge, they joined Phillips. And then ultimately, when the Phillips situation was resolved and merged back into the regular Grand Lodge, Holland just wrote it in and became a regular lodge again. But Holland, it was a very unusual turn of events that Holland declared independence. And so this is my story tonight this is my story. Now, what happened? How did this happen? Who was involved? And finally, I'm going to address the biggest question mark, which is why? Why did they do this? What was the purpose? So just to introduce kind of the hero of the story, or maybe the anti-hero, I don't know, depending on your point of view. This is John J. Crane, who was the master of Holland Lodge during this period, and he also wrote those letters that I found, okay? Now, Crane is really was an extraordinary, talented young man. He was a physician. He studied medicine at Princeton College and then came to Manhattan, where he started his medical practice and developed it into one of the leading medical practices in the city. He was said to be one of the leading surgeons in the city. So he really is a man of talent and a man of means. And just as a side note, long after the events that I'm talking about, kind of later in his life, he married into great wealth. He married an heiress, and they owned quite a lot of real estate in Manhattan and Brooklyn. But anyway, even at this time, a very successful young man. He was initiated in Holland Lodge in 1851 and rose rapidly in Masonry. The very next year, he was master of Holland Lodge for his first term. So he went from being initiated to being master in a year. And then in 1855, June of 1855, he was a candidate for deputy Grand Master. Now, at this point, he was only 35 years old. He had been a Mason 4 years, never held a Grand Lodge office, and he was putting himself up as a candidate for the deputy Grand Mastership, and actually had some support behind him as well. Now, Crane did not win that election. John Lewis won that election and became deputy Grand Master that year. And that election loss was the event that really triggered what happened next, and triggered the chain of events that almost destroyed Holland Lodge. Because at the very next communication, right after the annual communication, I think it was June 4th, on June 11th, 1855, Holland Lodge had their stated communication as usual, and at that communication, they adopted resolutions declaring that they were independent of the Grand Lodge. And I have a little bit of their resolution here on my slide. Let me just read this out. So Holland Lodge number 8, feeling herself in common with her sister lodges in the city, aggrieved by repeated wrongs, and deeming it imperative upon her to support and maintain her ancient position and command the respect which has been ever extended to her by the Masonic world, and determined to adhere strictly to the ancient landmarks of the order and encourage the true principles of Masonry, is compelled to declare herself free and independent. And the vote was 37 ayes, 22 noes. So the ayes had, a majority, voted in favor of this resolution of independence. However, it's not a large majority, is it? 37 to 22 is not an overwhelming majority. And I should add that, the 37 ayes, that was only about 1/3 of the total membership of Holland Lodge. Because, of course, there are members who weren't attending that night. So it was really a small portion of Holland Lodge who wanted to take the step and declare themselves independent. So there were a lot of brothers in Holland Lodge who did not want to do this, who did not want to be independent. They wanted to stay. They wanted to stay with the regular Grand Lodge. So they went to the Grand Master Joseph Evans, who, as I said, was a great proponent of unity, and they told Grand Master Evans what had happened, which is that Holland Lodge had declared independence, and their master, John Crane, had actually he took physical possession of the charter and took it with him, okay? So Crane had the charter in his possession. Evans contacted Crane and demanded that he give the charter back, and Crane refused. So Crane was totally disregarding the authority, the Masonic authority of the Grand Master, and said, "I'm not giving the charter back." So what happened ultimately is Evans gave the loyalists, the Holland loyalists, a dispensation to continue to meet as Holland Lodge No. 8, and ultimately they did get a warrant to meet as Holland Lodge No. 8. So, when I say Holland Lodge declared independence, I mean, it would be more accurate to say that Holland Lodge split into two lodges. There was the splitter Holland Lodge, who was led by John J. Crane, and then there were the loyalists, and they were both called Holland Lodge No. 8. Okay, so, this was a very serious matter. I mean, it's got to be one of the worst things you can do as a Mason to rebel against the authority of the Grand Lodge. And in fact, Evans issued in July 1855, so within a month, Evans issued an edict against the Holland Lodge splitters, and I'll read a little bit of that. He says, "It is with painful regret we have to announce that a certain number of Masons, a portion of Holland Lodge No. 8, among whom is the master, having possession of the warrant, have declared themselves free and independent of our jurisdiction, thus forming a spurious body of Masons holding a clandestine relation to our Grand Lodge. We have demanded of the master the warrant and properties which order has not been obeyed. Be it known, therefore, that we do by these presents forbid all Masonic intercourse with the said clandestine lodge or with any of its members." And he goes on to explain that there are those members of the lodge who are true to our allegiance, and true to the duties devolving upon them as Masons, have petitioned for their warrant that the labors of the lodge may be continued. And he has to explain that further down, it will be necessary that great care be taken to preserve the distinction between the Holland Lodge No. 8 under our jurisdiction and the clandestine body who presume to assume the same name and number, particularly as the latter have possession of the old warrant belonging to Holland Lodge, and by which they may endeavor to set forth their legitimacy. So the Holland Lodge splitters were expelled from the fraternity. They were absolutely kicked out, and that was the situation. That was their choice for some reason, which I will get to. Now, in trying to understand what actually happened here, how did this all occur? It's very helpful to us that the two sides here, the splitters on the one hand and the loyalists on the other hand, they each published a pamphlet explaining their position to the public. So, I mean, that's something that one would do back in this day, is if you had a position you wanted everyone to know about, you could have a pamphlet printed up, published, and it would be circulated around, and eventually it winds up in our library, the Livingston Library, where we can read it and try to understand what happened. But yes, each side published a pamphlet explaining themselves. Okay, so what do they have to say about themselves? So the splitters came out very strong and said it was imperative necessity has induced Holland Lodge No. 8 to cast aside the allegiance to which she has hitherto been subject, and to declare herself free and independent of all control and authority, save such as the ancient landmarks and usages of the order have prescribed. The rights of the lodges of the city of New York have been trampled on, and their privileges violated by a clique. So they were blaming this all on a clique that was running the Grand Lodge and doing bad things to the city lodges. They go on to say, we all recognize the justness of the principles which govern the acts of the Phillips Grand Lodge, but we differed as to the propriety of the measures adopted in its organization. So they're saying they sympathize with the Phillips Grand Lodge and those past masters who lost their right to vote, but they didn't approve of the riot. They couldn't get behind Phillips because that riot, that's an inauspicious way for a Masonic body to come into existence. And furthermore, they say, in 5 years, the clique has ushered into existence 3 new Grand Lodges, and now by their more recent acts have driven us to the point where forbearance ceases to be a virtue. Self-respect demands that we should make some effort to preserve our dignity and maintain intact the reputation of one of the oldest lodges in the state. We are satisfied that we are right, and we are determined to maintain the stand we have taken. So they're going to stick to their guns, okay? They're sure that they were right. They had a number of other complaints about the Grand Lodge, like the way the Grand Lodge was spending their money and so on. They had kind of a basket of complaints about the Grand Lodge. Now, I'll just to drop a hint here. There's a lot that they're not saying in this pamphlet, which is what's in the letters that I found. Okay, so they're not being entirely honest about why they declared independence. Now, for the loyalists, they put out their pamphlet. What did they have to say? They began by putting this in context. They say that all Masonic doings, particularly in the city of New York, become matters of history, and those who will succeed us will hereafter look back and doubt the truth of our record, that any Master Mason could possibly have forgotten his obligations as such. And they say in this pamphlet, this has nothing to do with Phillips Grand Lodge or how the Grand Lodge is spending its money. It's something more mundane than that. They say, we may be asked, brethren, why all this difficulty in a lodge so long noted for its zeal, intelligence, and moral worth? How has it originated? Where shall we look for such a precedent, except it be in the mad selfishness of unsatisfied ambition? They blame John Crane and his unsatisfied ambition to be Deputy Grand Master for this independence which Crane was heading up and leading. And they go on to say something very unusual. They go on to say this. The prophetic vision of a past Grand Master saw what was to take place in Holland Lodge, saw that her temple was to be rent asunder. They say that in March, prior to the annual election of the Grand Lodge in June last, a past Grand Master said that unless Dr. Crane, then Master of the Lodge, was elected Deputy Grand Master, there would be a breakup in Holland Lodge and 30 or more lodges would follow. And immediately after the election, he repeated the same assertion. Okay, so this is interesting, that there was a past Grand Master who apparently knew what was going to happen. in Holland Lodge, at least he thought he did, that Holland Lodge would split up. And that did in fact happen, right? And this thing about 30 lodges following out the door, that didn't happen. So what was this all about? Was this some sort of a bluff? And the Holland loyalists in their pamphlet, they're very discreet in that they do not name the past Grand Master who was saying these things in support of Crane's candidacy. But in the years that I have been investigating this incident, I was able to determine who this past Grand Master was. It was Oscar Coles, who was Grand Master in 1851. Now, Coles stayed with the regular Grand Lodge throughout this period. He didn't go off with any schismatic groups. However, he was, I would say he was very discontented with the regular Grand Lodge, and he undermined the Grand Lodge in various ways. One thing he was up to was he was a leader of the faction that wanted to divide the Grand Lodge. If you remember that slide that I had up showing a map of New York, dividing it into two jurisdictions, he made the motion to divide the Grand Lodge in that way. He was also, this is a side note, but he also protested against the installation of Chancellor Reuben Walworth as Grand Master, which is a side note, but I mean, this was just another incident in which he went against the regular Grand Lodge. And when the Phillips past masters were getting organized, making their plans, he was present at the organizational meeting. Even though he was Deputy Grand Master at that time, he was at their organizational meeting, in his individual capacity. And it also turns out that the very night that Holland Lodge declared independence, it elected him to honorary membership in Holland Lodge. So connecting all the dots here, okay, I'm going to say that whatever was going on in Holland Lodge, whatever the plan was, Oscar Coles was behind it. He was the mastermind of whatever it was that was going on in Holland Lodge. But whatever the reason was, Holland Lodge had declared independence, okay? And at this point, I would like to thank the Holland Lodge Historical Society for giving me access to the minutes of Holland Lodge and permission to use these materials. I have here on the screen a slide which shows the title of the minutes of Holland Lodge for the first communication of their independence. And you can see that they now style themselves Holland Lodge AYM, Ancient York Masons, because they're now independent and they're now, they're standing on the platform of the pre-Grand Lodge organization of the craft, or so they thought. So what was it like in Holland Lodge during their independence? Well, they continued to meet. They continued to work as usual, as they normally would. They didn't miss a single stated communication. They conferred the degrees of Masonry on candidates, having no authority to do so other than what they claimed for themselves. They also had fraternal relations with the Phillips lodges. They had intervisitation with some of the Phillips lodges, but it's a very bad situation that they found themselves in, being expelled and being clandestine. And in fact, they were told at one point, early in 1856, Crane had to come to the lodge to say, we have to find a new meeting place, because apparently Evans was letting it be known that any lodge that was meeting in the same building as Holland Lodge AYM was going to be suspended from Masonry. So they were told really by their landlord that they needed to find other accommodations, which they eventually did. By June 1856, they had found a new place to meet. But as time went on, this isn't a satisfactory situation at all. And they started to look for some way out of this predicament that they were in. Now, it was well known in the city that The Phillips Grand Lodge was still going on at this time, but there were negotiations going on between Phillips on the one hand and the regular Grand Lodge on the other hand to come to some sort of a settlement, an arrangement that would end that schism. So there was talk going back and forth. So within the Holland Lodge, there was the idea was germinated that maybe when this Phillips situation is resolved, maybe somehow we can get involved in that. And they appointed a committee, including Crane, to see whether when the Phillips situation was patched up, whether Holland could somehow be a party to that reunion and get in with that and become regular again. Now, at the beginning of 1857, in January, it looked like there was going to be a breakthrough in the division between Phillips and the regular Grand Lodge, because a word was going around the city that a settlement agreement had actually been reached between Phillips and the city. So it looked like it was imminent. This reunion was going to happen imminently. So Crane and his committee approached the Phillips Grand Lodge and submitted a return to them on behalf of Holland Lodge and said that Holland Lodge would join the Phillips Grand Lodge, which I think came as a surprise to the Phillips Grand Lodge because no one had done this. This is the only time in their existence that a lodge came to join them. But they were quite pleased. They were quite pleased that this happened. So they held a special meeting of their Grand Lodge just to receive Crane and his delegation from Holland. And I have here some, on my slide here, I have some excerpts from the transactions of the Phillips Grand Lodge. And it's very interesting. Let me read a little bit of this. I'm pleased to inform you that I have received notice from the Right Worshipful Grand Secretary that Holland Lodge No. 8 have made a return to this Grand Lodge and that their officers and representatives are now present. I congratulate you upon the return of this highly respectable lodge to our union, and that we are to be hereafter aided by the counsel of the officers and representatives of that lodge. May the return of Holland Lodge to this jurisdiction be the precursor of a restoration of harmony in the entire fraternity in the state, and I now take great pleasure in presenting to you the Worshipful Master, wardens, and representatives of Holland Lodge No. 8. So Crane addressed the Phillips Grand Lodge there assembled, and what he told them was, and this is in the bottom picture here, that they had been discussing the situation involving the craft with able counselors, lawyers, in the state about this controversy, and they had received an opinion that the Phillips Grand Lodge was going to win the lawsuits and they would be adjudged the regular Grand Lodge. So he said, that whenever it came up for a decision by a court or a jury, the right would be unquestionably adjudged to this body, the Phillips Grand Lodge. And on that opinion, Holland Lodge had relied, and the representatives of the lodge were accordingly present. Now, may I say that Crane was not being truthful in the statement to the Phillips Grand Lodge, because we know what they really thought was that Phillips was about to merge into the regular Grand Lodge. They weren't going to be around for very long, and that's why they were there. But that's, he couldn't say that. He couldn't say that to the Phillips Grand Lodge. He had to tell them, yes, well, we think you're actually the regular Grand Lodge, so we're very happy to join you. So anyway, so now they're no longer independent. They're now one of the Phillips lodges. And as 1857 went on, it came to be June, which was when everyone had their annual communications. The Grand Lodges had their annual communications in June, and the reunion, the terms of the reunion, the settlement, came up for a vote in the regular Grand Lodge, and it was a disaster. Because these terms that they had agreed to, they did the best they could after negotiating for 9 years, but there were a lot of technical problems with this proposed union. For example, it was going to require amendments to the Constitution, and there were some other technical problems with actually implementing this union. And on top of that, the country lodges, remember them? The country lodges did not want the Phillips troublemakers readmitted to the fraternity. They didn't want them back. So when it finally came down to voting, yay or nay, on the settlement agreement, the vote went overwhelmingly against it. 247 yes, 780 no. So this reunion that everyone was hoping for, especially Holland Lodge and John J. Crane, who was just going to save them, it didn't happen. So not great. So then where does this leave Holland Lodge? Well, now they're not even independent anymore. They don't have the pride of being an independent lodge. Now they're just, under the Phillips Grand Lodge, which they didn't even think, probably, they didn't really believe was regular. And it was a very desperate situation, because honestly, nobody knew at the time whether this Phillips business was ever going to be settled. Nobody knew, and there was a kind of a action all over the state to try to convince the country lodges that you've got to approve this. You've got to bail us out of this situation. So that was where Crane and his lodge wound up, kind of washed up as a Phillips lodge. And let me get back to my notes here. So as 1857 went on, they were getting increasingly desperate, okay? And they were looking in all directions for some way out of this predicament, until at the very end of 1857 in December, at their very last communication of the year, they kind of, they bit the bullet and said, we're going to have to contact the loyalist Holland Lodge and see if they'll take us back, because what else can we do at this point? So they formed a committee, including Crane, to go back to the regular Holland Lodge No. 8 and say, would you just take us back? We can just forget about all this. Well, Crane, after making this contact, Crane came back to Holland Lodge with the reply, and the reply was not from the loyalist Holland Lodge. The reply was from the regular Grand Lodge, and it was bad news. And Crane said, there was no way that we can go back to the regular Grand Lodge as an intact lodge. In fact, here's what he had to say in summary. In January 1858, he said, look, first of all, okay, the Grand Lodge denies that we are Holland Lodge. They say the real Holland Lodge is with them, the loyalists. And secondly, that we've all been expelled. We've all been expelled from Masonry, and the loyalist Holland Lodge can't take us back. So what the Grand Lodge told him is, look, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to surrender the warrant and all the property of the lodge and dissolve. And then you can individually petition for restoration. And maybe the loyalist Holland Lodge will take some of you back, but you will have to pass the ordeal of the ballot box. You'll have to be proposed and balloted on, and maybe then. But that was the situation they found themselves in. So it was a pretty dark day. And Crane told his members that, look, the time has come here to make a decision, that if we accept these terms, that is the end of Holland Lodge as we know it. And I'm willing to do it. He told his lodge, I'm willing to do this only if we agree unanimously that this is the course that we want to take. But as long as there's one brother who wants to continue as in our current organization, I will not do this. So that was the question before Holland Lodge at this time, and there was a discussion about it, and the members of Holland Lodge decided that it was dishonorable it would be very dishonorable to accept these terms, so they decided not to do it. So they decided to carry on, and they did carry on. Now, this was the darkest moment, but you know, it's always darkest before the dawn. And what happened next was the following year, later in 1858, at the annual communication in June, the Articles of Union were finally approved. So they tried again, and finally the Grand Lodge said, yes, we accept these terms. And the Phillips Grand Lodge merged back into the regular Grand Lodge, and all the Phillips lodges were received back in as regular lodges. All the brothers received back in. It was over for the Splitter Holland Lodge. They had it done. And the terms of the agreement were, first of all, there is but one Grand Lodge in the state of New York. So that was agreed again. And there's another term in this, the settlement agreement that influenced Holland Lodge in particular, which is this. If there were two lodges from the two different Grand Lodges that had the same number, the lodge that held the original charter would get to keep the number, and the other lodge would have to take a new number. Now who had the charter? As between the Splitters and the Loyalists, who had the charter? It was the Splitters had the original charter in their possession, because Crane took it and he didn't give it back when Grandmaster Evans demanded that he give it back, okay? So the Splitter Holland Lodge got to keep the number 8, and the Loyalist had to take a new number. And I've also included on the slide this section, which I like, which is all allusions to past difficulties should be avoided. So no one is supposed to say, you remember when we started a riot, in 1848? No one was supposed to talk about it anymore. But that was this was the resolution as far as it goes. And so thereafter, there were two lodges called Holland Lodge. There was Holland Lodge number 8, and then there was Holland Lodge number 16, who were the Loyalists, okay? So it seems that the Loyalists are kind of getting the short end of the stick here. And the following year, the two Holland Lodges were represented at the Grand Lodge. Holland number 8 was represented by its officers, including Crane, and Holland Lodge number 16 sent as the representative Joseph Evans, who was not a member of their lodge. They just chose him to be their proxy. To present their case to the Grand Lodge that something had gone amiss here, okay? Because as Loyalists, maybe they should have got to keep the charter and the number. And why did the Splitters get that privilege? So according to the transactions of the Grand Lodge, Joseph Evans presented a memorial from Holland Lodge number 16, which was referred to the Committee on the Condition of Masonry. In the memorial, well, I don't have that memorial, but it must have been pleading for some sort of fair resolution to this, that they should be Lodge number 8, not the Splitters. And it's interesting that John Crane got himself appointed to this committee subsequently. So Crane is on the committee that's going to decide this question. Well, anyway, the decision came down from the committee about what to do. So they had to say that the committee are strongly impressed with the equities of the memorialists, the Loyalist Holland Lodge. It is a matter of regret that the question had not been adjusted prior to the adoption of the Articles of Union. That omission has resulted in apparent injustice to them. We have examined the question fully and carefully and have been attended by the respective parties and have heard their views. The Articles of Union have placed the matter beyond our reach, and the prayer of the memorialists could not be granted without a violation of these articles. So what they're saying is, our hands are tied. I mean, obviously, the Loyalists, have a pretty strong case. That they should be still Holland Lodge number 8, but we don't want to, disturb the Articles of Union. And goodness knows what would happen next. It might cause another schism. So they had to say, there's nothing we could do. So poor Holland Lodge number 16 chose a new name for themselves, which is Prince of Orange Lodge. And And Joseph Evans was actually so moved by all this that he demitted from his mother lodge and joined Prince of Orange Lodge number 16 and was its master. And over the years, Prince of Orange consolidated, went through a couple of consolidations, and today there is no Prince of Orange Lodge number 16. So the loyalists kind of faded away, which seems very unfair, but that is in fact what happened. Okay. Goodness gracious, I've been going for over an hour. Is anyone still with me? Okay, I hope somebody's still watching this. I apologize for the length of this. I didn't know how long I was going to go, but we're getting within sight of the end, because this is the end of the story as far as we can tell from public documents, from the transactions of the Grand Lodge and from the publications and even from the Holland minutes. This is basically the story, but it's not the entire story, because the letters, remember the letters that Crane wrote, which tell the real story. Okay, so let me, at long last, after an hour, let me turn now to these letters and finally wrap this up. So the letters, he wrote these letters in 1861. So this is 3 years after the reunion. And at this point, Crane was deputy Grand Master. He finally won an election and was elected deputy Grand Master. He's writing these letters to the current master of Holland Lodge, Joseph Balestier. And what was going on is Balestier was preparing an address on the history of Holland Lodge, which he was going to present to the lodge and to the distinguished visitors in the Grand Line. And he was working on this presentation. And prior to that, a couple of weeks prior to the presentation, he was discussing with Crane. Crane was asking, so how's it going? What are you going to talk about? And Balestier said, Balestier said that he was going, in his address, he was going to propose dividing the Grand Lodge, because Balestier thought that would be a good idea. Now, when Crane heard this, he had a very bad reaction to this after what he had been through and what Holland Lodge had been through. Thought it was a very bad idea to say anything about dividing the Grand Lodge, especially in front of the Grand Line and everything. It was absolutely something that should not be done. So Crane wrote a letter to Balestier, and I've given a lot of thought about how to present these letters, and I think that what I've decided to do is just read portions of them, because it's so extraordinary, and especially the language that's being used, and bearing in mind that this is Crane speaking to us many decades later, and basically spilling the beans, telling the whole story about what really happened in Holland Lodge. So let me turn to that right away. Dear Balestier, the declaration that you made last evening that a portion of your proposed address discusses the question of a separation of the Grand Lodge has caused me to consider the matter very seriously and induced me to communicate with you on the subject. After mature reflection, I am convinced that every allusion to this delicate question will be fraught with mischief and will meet with a hearty disapproval of every member of Holland Lodge. The action of our lodge in 1855 had for its purpose the establishment of a city Grand Lodge, and consequently a division of the Grand Lodge of the state. And you well know the costs of such action and how the lodge suffered in the attempt and how signally it failed. But let me just stop right there and point out that this is an amazing discovery here, because there's nothing in the public record that says that they were trying to start a city Grand Lodge. This information only exists in these letters, but apparently that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to get a new city Grand Lodge started. Okay, so let me continue reading here. At that time, there appeared to be some just ground for such action, for there were two bodies, each claiming to be a Grand Lodge, and there were grave doubts in the minds of many which was entitled to be considered the parent body. Indeed, Masons hailing from the state were refused admittance into lodges of other jurisdictions, and added to the fact that two Grand Lodges were exercising their authority in the city, was a sufficient reason that Holland should desire a separation of the settlement should be made, taking the position that the difficulty should be settled either by a union of the rival bodies or by a separate city Grand Lodge. And the former happily was the result, and now peace and harmony reign throughout this great jurisdiction. And there's no cause for complaint, as the laws and edicts of the grand body are just alike to all members of the vast Masonic fraternity. Under these circumstances, it appears to me that it will be highly improper even to broach the subject in a public address before the lodge, delivered at the request of its members and for a specific purpose. It will engender hard feelings and arouse a spirit which we have labored long to subdue, and again bring our ancient and distinguished lodge into disrepute, and to cause to degrade it in the estimation of the true Mason than aught else that could be suggested. To me, the whole subject savors too much of the spirit of secession from and rebellion against the authority of the Grand Lodge, which body at the time of the Union expressly declared that there is but one Grand Lodge and one Grand Master in the state of New York. But I will not pursue the subject further, but simply make a request, which I feel warranted in believing that you will grant, that you will strike out all that portion of your address that touches upon the subject of a division of the Grand Lodge. I do this so that we all agree, and you may give additional evidence of the loyalty of Holland Lodge to the most worshipful Grand Lodge of the state of New York, to which it owns allegiance. Truly and fraternally yours, John J. Crane. Please let me know your views. So Balestier received this letter, and he wrote back to Crane. Now, I don't have the letter that Balestier wrote to Crane. It was not with these papers. However, Crane felt he needed to respond to Balestier and wrote a second letter, which contains even more details about what was going on. November 19th, he writes, in reply to your truly fraternal note of the 14th instant, I will explain to you the position of Holland Lodge relative to its acts in 1855. The first step that was taken had for its express purpose the formation of the city Grand Lodge. 4 masters of lodges pledged themselves to me that if Holland would take the initiative in this Declaration of Independence, that they would surely follow, and then having 5 lodges, we could proceed to form a city Grand Lodge. It was our misfortune to hold the first meeting when we proceeded to fulfill our part of the compact, but Eureka Lodge, following next, proved faithless to her vow, and the project failed. So, wow, Holland was not alone in this plot to start a city Grand Lodge. There were 4 other lodges involved, Eureka Lodge and 3 others who I've been unable to identify. But what was supposed to happen was they would all declare independence, and then they would combine to form a new Grand Lodge, I guess, citing the precedent of 1717, when the original Grand Lodge was formed in London of 4 lodges, okay? And presumably this would be more acceptable than what the Phillips Lodge had done, Phillips Grand Lodge had done, which was to start a riot, that this would be possibly Masonically correct. I guess this was supposed to be the idea. But what happened is the other lodges just left Holland just hanging out there and didn't join in. So Crane goes on to say, then having declared ourselves free from the government of the parent body, we were obliged to take position as an independent lodge and not acknowledge ourselves dupes of designing men, or rather of those who owed their influence entirely to Masonry and hence could not afford to be under the ban of censure even for a short time. So Crane says, we didn't want to look like idiots. So we had to carry on. We had to brazen it out and maintain ourselves as an independent body. So you can see what I was saying earlier about how these men, never wanted to admit a mistake and never wanted to back down. They couldn't back down. They didn't want to look like idiots. So he says, I am surprised to find you're not informed about this part of our history. I will be pleased at any time to give you a detailed account of the whole affair in order that you may have a full understanding of the condition of matters at that time. He says, because Balestier was arguing back at him. So Crane says, The allusion to the remarks I made in public relative to the conduct of the lodge in 1855 and my participation in those scenes is not an argument against my present declaration. I stated that under the same circumstances, with the same causes existing, 2 Grand Lodges, brethren being refused admission, I would pursue the same line of conduct, as indicated by me at that time, believing I would thereby affect a union of the discordant elements. The assertion I was delivering a lecture to you is, to say most unkind. It was farthest from my thoughts. I am sending these kind and earnest measures at the request of others, only to bring the subject strongly before your mind that you may see the propriety of the objections I have made and be governed accordingly. Again, you allude to the fact of my being in a high position, and you remark that you are still the master of Holland Lodge, and it is not kind for any to say that your opinion will be opposed by every member of the lodge. I intended no offense, but was giving my reasons for addressing you especially, and I still believe my assertion is correct, and that all will be opposed to the discussion and not your opinion, for these have not been expressed, and consequently there's no occasion for any argument on that point. You will pardon me for intruding upon your valuable time, but I am unwilling that you should entertain opinions so contrary to what I have desired to convey, for we both have a mutual desire to add to the dignity and position of our time-honored lodge, and neither would do aught to detract in any manner from its influence, or degrade it in the opinion of worthy and high-minded Masons. Truly and fraternally yours, John J.J. Crane. So what have we learned here? What really happened with Holland Lodge? First of all, that there was a previously unknown plot in 1855 to start a new city Grand Lodge. Past Grand Master Oscar Coles was the mastermind of this plot. So plan A was to get John Crane elected Deputy Grand Master, because remember, that's how this started. He ran for Deputy Grand Master and presumably would be sympathetic to dividing the Grand Lodge, but he lost the election. So they immediately pivoted to plan B, which is 5 lodges declare independence, and then they would unite. Holland Lodge followed through, but Eureka and the other lodges reneged. The Holland splitters did not want to look like dupes, so they just brazened it out until they managed to get back into the regular Grand Lodge via the Phillips Grand Lodge. And the Holland Lodge of today is the splitters. The loyalists faded away. And that is the real untold until now story of the Odyssey of Holland Lodge. Now, just to wrap things up, I've gone on awfully long, but just to wrap things up, just a final note that, that Crane, the next year after writing the letters, he was elected Grand Master. And he said, in the years that are past and are not very remote, we have been afflicted with many vicissitudes, but through the magnanimity, forbearance, and devotion to the craft on the part of many beloved brethren, some of whom are all around me now, all our troubles have been happily healed. Let our consciences be our guides, the highest good of the craft our aim, and the blessings of God will follow. So that is my presentation, and I would like to thank brothers Andrew Payne and Christopher Allen of Holland Lodge and the Holland Lodge Historical Society, the Livingston Library and staff. Thank you for this opportunity. And if you are interested in the Age of Schisms and want to learn more about it, I did a lecture entitled "Who Was Liberty Lodge No. 7," which is on the YouTube channel. And also I have an article out in the current edition of Phil Lathy's journal on the revived St. John's Grand Lodge, which I guess I could make available to anyone who is interested. But that is that's my long presentation. And if there's anyone still has stayed with me this long, I would be happy to answer any questions that there might be.